The sky was heavy with the weight of an approaching storm as Lena trudged up the walkway to her house, a familiar chill settling in her bones. It had been a year to the day since her sister Emily had disappeared, and no amount of police reports or endless nights spent searching could fill the hollow ache in her chest. Her shoes scuffed against the cracked pavement, each step a reminder of the hopelessness that had come to define her life. As she reached the door, something out of place caught her eye. A package, small and square, rested on the welcome mat. No return address. Lena frowned, her pulse quickening as unease slid beneath her skin. She hadn't ordered anything, and she didn't recognize the handwriting, neat, almost too perfect, as though written by someone who had practiced every letter with care. Lena crouched down, hesitating before picking it up. There was a note taped to the top, just 2 words written in a smooth, fluid hand: "She's waiting." Her breath caught in her throat. Emily. With trembling fingers, she tore the tape and pulled open the box. Nestled inside, wrapped in dark velvet, was a mirror. It was small, about the size of a picture frame, but intricate, its silver frame twisted into strange, archaic patterns, symbols that Lena didn't recognize. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread as she lifted it out, the smooth glass cold against her skin. Lena stood, clutching the mirror, her eyes locked onto her own reflection. A distorted image stared back at her, as though something beneath the surface wasn't quite right. She blinked, shook her head, and exhaled sharply, convincing herself it was nothing more than exhaustion. But the note's words lingered, like a cold whisper at the back of her mind: "She's waiting." Lena carried the mirror inside, shutting the door behind her, and placed it in the small room that had once been Emily's painting studio. The moment she set it down, a strange weight settled in her chest, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She tried to shake the feeling. Just tired. Just stressed. But deep down, she knew the truth: something was wrong. The night was suffocatingly still. Hours had passed since she placed the mirror in Emily's old room, but sleep eluded Lena. She tossed and turned in bed, the sheets twisted around her legs, her mind racing with memories of her sister, her laugh, her vibrant smile, and then the deafening silence after she was gone. Unable to bear the restlessness any longer, Lena slipped out of bed, padding quietly down the hall toward the small room. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the street lamp outside, its light filtering through the curtains in thin slivers. Lena hesitated at the doorway. The mirror sat there, its surface smooth and undisturbed, catching just enough light to shimmer faintly. She stepped closer, her heart thrumming in her chest. The glass seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble, but when Lena blinked, the surface was still again. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool glass. For a split second, her reflection shifted, a shadowy figure standing just behind her own image. Her breath hitched, and she spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing moved except for the slight flutter of the curtains in the breeze. She turned back to the mirror, her reflection now clear and unchanged. But something was different. Lena leaned in closer, squinting at the glass. The air seemed to grow thicker, pressing against her skin, and a faint sound, barely audible, whispered from somewhere behind her. It was as if the house was alive, watching, waiting. With a shiver, Lena backed away, her pulse still hammering in her ears. It was probably just her mind playing tricks on her, a product of the sleepless nights and her endless search for answers. That's all it is, she told herself. But even as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her through the mirror. The next morning, Lena found herself standing in front of an old antique shop downtown, the wind biting at her skin. She hadn't slept. The memory of the shadow in the mirror clung to her like fog, blurring the line between what was real and what wasn't. She needed answers. The bell above the shop door tinkled as she stepped inside. The musty smell of old wood and forgotten relics filled the air, and shelves packed with strange, ancient objects towered over her, casting long shadows on the floor. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, glanced up from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice dry and raspy. Lena approached, clutching the mirror tightly to her chest. "I found this," she said, placing it carefully on the counter. "Do you know anything about it?" The shopkeeper's expression shifted the moment he saw the mirror. His eyes narrowed, and his hands stilled, the lines on his face deepening. "Where did you get this?" "It was left on my doorstep," Lena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what it is?" The shopkeeper ran his fingers along the frame, tracing the symbols etched into the silver. "This is no ordinary mirror," he said after a long pause. "It's older than anything in this shop. Mirrors like these have a history, a dark one." Lena's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "There are stories," he continued, his voice low, as though the very walls of the shop might hear. "Stories of mirrors that hold more than just reflections. Some believe they can trap souls. Others say they act as windows, gateways to places we're not meant to see." A cold shiver ran down Lena's spine. "If you want real answers," the shopkeeper said, his gaze fixed on the mirror, "there's a man you should see. Lucas Brent. He deals with objects like these. But I'll warn you, he's not the kind of man you seek out lightly." Lena hesitated, her mind swirling with the implications of what the shopkeeper was saying. But the thought of Emily, trapped somewhere beyond the glass, was too powerful to ignore. "Where can I find him?" she asked, her voice firm. That night, Lena sat across from the mirror, her heart heavy with anticipation. The antique shopkeeper's words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't shake the pull she felt toward the mirror. She knew Lucas Brent could offer her answers, but something inside her needed to see Emily for herself again. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. Lena stared into the mirror's surface, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, and the mirror's surface began to ripple again, more violently this time. Lena's pulse quickened as an image began to form, her reflection shifting, warping. Then she saw her. Emily. Her sister stood far behind her reflection, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. She mouthed something, Lena couldn't hear the words, but she could feel their weight. Lena gasped, reaching out instinctively toward the glass. "Emily." But before she could do anything, Emily's image faded, slipping away into the darkness of the mirror, leaving only Lena's reflection staring back at her, wild-eyed and alone. Lena's heart raced, her mind spinning. It wasn't her imagination. It couldn't be. Emily was there, she had seen her, felt her presence. She had to find Lucas Brent. He would know what to do. He would help her bring Emily back. The next day, Lena stood outside Lucas Brent's shop, a dilapidated, forgotten building tucked away in a narrow alley. It felt out of place, as though time had passed it by without a second glance. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior of the shop was dim, lit only by the faint glow of candlelight. Strange artifacts lined the walls, old books, ancient relics, things that seemed to hum with a strange energy. A figure stood at the back of the room, his tall frame shrouded in shadow. "You're looking for answers," Lucas Brent said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "But be warned, some truths come at a price." Lena swallowed hard, stepping forward. "I don't care. I need to save my sister." Brent's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Then you've already begun walking the path you can't turn back from." Lena's breath hitched as he gestured toward the mirror she had carried with her. "The final link to Emily." Brent smiled darkly, his words a whispered promise. "But remember, mirrors don't just reflect, they reveal." The house felt different when Lena returned from Lucas Brent's shop. The shadows clung to the corners of each room, thicker than they had ever been, and the air was heavy, almost oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the old house seemed amplified, as though the walls themselves were whispering. Lena stood in the hallway, staring toward the room where the mirror sat, her thoughts swirling with Brent's cryptic warnings. The mirror, he had said, was not just a reflection, it was a conduit, a window that allowed things to cross between worlds. She could still hear his words echoing in her mind, "Some truths come at a price." Her body felt as heavy as the atmosphere around her, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She knew she shouldn't be here, alone with that cursed object. But she couldn't help it. Emily was waiting, trapped behind the glass, just out of reach. She had seen her, really seen her, and there was no going back now. With slow, deliberate steps, Lena moved toward the room where the mirror waited. The wooden floor creaked beneath her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence of the house. She hesitated at the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the dim light of the room, the mirror sat like a dark sentinel, its surface as smooth and still as ice. But something was wrong. The air felt charged, like static before a storm, and Lena's heart thudded in her chest as she stepped inside. For a long moment, she stared into the glass, her reflection staring back at her, hollow-eyed and pale. But then, just for an instant, a flicker, a faint ripple broke the surface of the mirror. Lena leaned closer, her pulse quickening, as the ripples grew, distorting her reflection. And there, deep within the swirling glass, she thought she saw it again, Emily, but only for a second. Her breath hitched. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. But the reflection was gone, leaving only her own face staring back at her from the darkened glass. The oppressive silence returned, more deafening than before. Lena backed away from the mirror, her heart racing. She had seen her. She was sure of it. Emily was in there, waiting, just beyond her reach. But how long would she wait? How much time did Lena have before the mirror claimed her sister forever? Lena didn't hear the knock on the front door at first. Her mind was still spinning, trapped in the thoughts of Emily, the mirror, and Brent's ominous warnings. It wasn't until the door opened with a soft creak that she snapped out of her trance. "Lena!" The familiar voice belonged to Sarah, her best friend. Sarah stepped into the hallway, concern etched across her face as she closed the door behind her. Lena wiped a hand across her face, trying to push away the lingering fog of dread. "Hey, Sarah. What are you doing here?" Sarah frowned, glancing at Lena's disheveled appearance, her unwashed hair, the dark circles beneath her eyes. "I came to check on you. I haven't heard from you in days. You haven't been answering my calls." Lena shifted uncomfortably. "I've been busy." "Busy?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "With what?" Lena hesitated, her eyes darting to the room with the mirror. She wanted to tell Sarah everything, that Emily was trapped, that she had found a way to save her. But she knew how Sarah would react. I'm getting closer to finding Emily," Lena said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's expression softened, but there was a hint of frustration in her eyes. "Lena, it's been a year. The police." "I don't care what the police say," Lena snapped, her voice rising. "They don't understand. No one does." Sarah took a step forward, her hands outstretched in a gesture of calm. "I know you're hurting. I know you miss her, but..." "No, you don't know." Lena cut her off, her chest heaving. "You don't understand what I've seen, what I know." Sarah frowned. "What are you talking about?" Lena swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to tell Sarah the truth, but would she believe her? Or would she think Lena was going mad? I've seen Emily," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "She's in the mirror, Sarah. I know how it sounds, but I'm not crazy. I've seen her." For a moment, Sarah just stared at her, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. "Lena, you're not well." Lena shook her head violently. "No. I'm not imagining things. The mirror, there's something wrong with it. I saw her reflection, and she was trying to reach me. She's trapped. I know she is." Sarah sighed, rubbing her hands over her face. "Lena, I'm worried about you. You're not thinking straight. You've been alone in this house for too long, surrounded by memories, and it's messing with your mind." "You think I'm crazy," Lena said bitterly, turning away from Sarah. "Just like everyone else." "I don't think you're crazy," Sarah said softly. "I think you're grieving, and I think you need help. Please, Let me take you somewhere you can talk to someone. I don't need help, Lena muttered, her back still turned. I need to save my sister. Silence hung between them, thick and tense. Finally, Sarah sighed, her voice heavy with frustration. I can't force you to listen. But I'll be here, Lena. If you need me. Lena didn't respond. She stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the room where the mirror waited, her mind already slipping back into the dark pull of its reflection. Sarah hesitated a moment longer before quietly leaving the house. As the door clicked shut, Lena felt a deep sense of isolation wrap around her like a cold shroud. She was alone now, truly alone. But it didn't matter. She knew what she had to do. Sleep did not come easily that night. Lena lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlpool of thoughts and memories. She felt pulled in two directions, toward the impossible reality of the mirror and Emily, and the rational part of her mind that echoed Sarah's words. Was she losing it? Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and Lena fell into a restless sleep. The dreams came quickly, vivid and horrifying. She found herself standing in an old Victorian parlor, the air thick with the scent of burning candles and old wood. Before her stood a woman in a high-collared dress, her face contorted in terror. The woman screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. Her hands clawed at the surface of a tall, ornate mirror that looked exactly like the one in Lena's house. Suddenly, the mirror rippled, and the woman's body was pulled toward it, her fingers scrabbling uselessly against the glass. Lena tried to move, to scream, to help her, but her body felt frozen. The woman's face disappeared into the mirror, her mouth stretched in a final, silent scream. Lena awoke with a start, her heart racing, her body drenched in sweat. Her chest heaved as she sat up, gasping for breath. The dreams were becoming more vivid, more real. She looked around the dark room, her pulse still pounding in her ears. Outside, the wind howled against the house, rattling the windows. But something else was there, another sound. Whispers. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she realized the sound was coming from the room where the mirror was. Faint voices, like the echoes of forgotten souls, calling to her. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew it wasn't just a dream. The mirror wasn't just a cursed object, it was a gateway, and whatever was on the other side was reaching out. By dawn, Lena had made up her mind. She couldn't wait any longer. Emily was out there, trapped in some twisted version of reality, and Lena had the means to bring her back. She spent the early hours gathering the materials Lucas Brent had given her. Candles, salt, and the ancient incantation written in Brent's cramped handwriting. Her hands trembled as she set everything in place around the mirror, her heart thudding in her chest. She lit the candles, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the room. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping as Lena began to speak the incantation. The words felt foreign on her tongue, each syllable heavy with dark promise. The mirror began to ripple once more, the surface bubbling as though something just beneath it was struggling to break free. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their insistent murmurings. Lena's voice wavered as she continued the chant, her heart pounding in her chest. A cold, invisible force pressed against her, as though the room itself was closing in, suffocating her. The mirror vibrated violently, the air around it distorting, warping. She could feel it, something was about to happen. Then, a loud crash broke the tension. Lena spun around, her heart in her throat, as the front door slammed open, and a figure stepped into the house. Lucas Brent stood in the doorway, his face grim, his eyes flickering with an intensity that sent a shiver down Lena's spine. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, stepping forward, his voice cold and furious. "I'm saving my sister," Lena snapped, the words coming out sharper than she intended. Brent shook his head, his gaze flickering toward the mirror. "You don't know what you're dealing with. That mirror isn't just a reflection, it's a prison. And if you're not careful, it will claim both of you." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "I've seen her, Brent. Emily is in there. I know she is." Brent sighed, his shoulders sagging with an almost unbearable weight. You've seen a version of her, a shadow of what she once was. But that's not your sister anymore. The mirror's been feeding off your grief, your obsession. It's twisting your memories. Lena's hands clenched into fists. You're lying. I wish I was, Brent said quietly. But I've seen what the mirror can do. You think you can break the curse, but once you've started down this path, there's no turning back. I don't care, Lena growled, her eyes blazing. I'll do whatever it takes. Brent's gaze darkened. Then you're already lost. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as Brent's words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. She could feel the pull of the mirror, its dark influence wrapping around her like tendrils of smoke. But she wouldn't stop, not now. Not when she was so close. Brent turned to leave, his expression grave. You've chosen your fate. Don't say I didn't warn you. As he walked out the door, Lena turned back to the mirror, her body trembling with anticipation and fear. The ritual wasn't finished yet. And neither was she. The mirror's surface rippled once more, a dark promise reflecting back at her. And this time, she was ready to face it. The room was silent except for the faint flickering of candlelight, casting long shadows across the floor. Lena stood before the mirror, her heart racing as the final words of the incantation hovered on her lips. Her hands trembled, clutching the ancient parchment Lucas Brent had given her, its faded ink barely legible in the dim light. She felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread as she glanced at the mirror's surface. It remained still, unnervingly calm, despite the chaos she had already summoned. Lena took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. This is it. This is the moment. She began to speak the final words of the incantation, her voice shaking as each syllable filled the air with weight. The moment the last word left her lips, a cold gust of wind seemed to rush through the room, extinguishing the candles in a violent flicker. The mirror trembled. The glass began to ripple, as though the surface were made of water disturbed by an unseen force. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and Lena could feel something pressing down on her, a palpable, malevolent presence. The room around her seemed to warp, distorting as though reality itself was bending under the weight of the mirror's dark influence. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back away. Not now. Not when she was so close. The ripples grew stronger, more violent. Lena's reflection wavered, twisting grotesquely in the glass, and then it wasn't her reflection anymore. It was Emily. She stood behind the glass, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her lips moved, mouthing silent words that Lena couldn't understand, but the desperation in her sister's eyes was unmistakable. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Emily looked so real, so close. Emily. Lena's voice cracked as she reached out toward the mirror, her fingers brushing the cold, rippling surface. I'm here. I'm going to get you out. But Emily didn't respond. She just stared, her wide eyes locked onto Lena's as the space between them seemed to collapse, the distance shrinking with every passing second. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that reverberated through Lena's bones. The room around her blurred, the walls melting into a swirling darkness, and the pressure in the air intensified, wrapping around her like an invisible force. Then, with a deafening crack, the mirror's surface split open, a dark void yawning wide before her. Lena stumbled back, her body trembling as she stared into the impossible. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was a doorway, its surface now a gaping black void. The hum that filled the air grew louder, vibrating through her skull, but it was the void itself that terrified her the most. It seemed to pull at her, beckoning her forward with an irresistible force. She glanced back at the spot where Emily had stood moments ago, but her sister was gone, vanished into the darkness. A surge of panic rose in Lena's chest. What if I'm too late? What if I can't save her? The pull of the mirror grew stronger, tugging at her with invisible hands. Lena's feet moved of their own accord, dragging her toward the open void. The air around her crackled with energy, the space warping and distorting as she crossed the threshold. And then, she fell. For what felt like an eternity, Lena plummeted through the dark, weightless and disoriented. There was no sound, no light, only the cold, suffocating nothingness that wrapped around her like a shroud. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the void. Just as the weightlessness became unbearable, Lena's body slammed into solid ground. Pain shot through her limbs as she gasped, her chest heaving for breath. She lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, trying to piece together where she was. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her hands trembling as they touched cold, smooth stone. The darkness around her was impenetrable, but as her eyes adjusted, she began to make out shapes, faint, distorted reflections of her surroundings. It was as though she had stepped into a twisted, shadowy version of the real world. Familiar objects and places were reflected back at her, but they were wrong, warped, decayed, as if time had corroded their very essence. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to stand. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. But then, through the shadows, she heard it, a faint voice, barely audible, calling her name. Lena. Her heart raced as she turned toward the sound. It was Emily's voice, distant but unmistakable. Emily, Lena called out, her voice echoing in the strange, warped space. She stumbled forward, following the voice, her hands reaching out blindly in the darkness. I'm coming. Hold on. The voice grew louder, clearer, and Lena pushed herself forward, her legs shaking with every step. The darkness parted before her, and there, standing in the middle of the void, was Emily. Lena's heart leapt at the sight of her sister. Emily stood motionless, her body bathed in the dim, cold light that filtered through the void. She looked exactly as Lena remembered, her wavy hair falling around her shoulders, her face pale and delicate. But there was something wrong. Emily's eyes. They were wide, staring blankly at Lena, but they seemed too dark, too hollow, as if the light behind them had been extinguished. Lena's steps faltered as she approached, her breath catching in her throat. Emily, she whispered, reaching out her hand. I'm here. I'm going to get you out. Emily didn't move. She just stood there, her expression unreadable, her lips slightly parted as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. A cold wave of dread washed over Lena. This wasn't right. Something was wrong. Emily, she tried again, her voice trembling. Say something. But Emily remained silent, her dark eyes fixed on Lena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Lena took another step forward, her hand outstretched. The closer she got, the colder the air became, until it was almost painful to breathe. Then, as Lena's fingers brushed Emily's arm, her sister's face twisted into a grotesque smile. Thank you for coming, Emily whispered, her voice unnaturally calm. I've been waiting for you. Lena recoiled, stumbling backward as a wave of icy terror surged through her veins. Emily's smile stretched wider, her face distorting into something unrecognizable, something twisted and wrong. Emily? Lena gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. What's happening? The thing that looked like Emily tilted its head, its smile never fading. You've come so far, Lena. But you should have listened. You can't save me. Lena's legs shook as she backed away, her mind reeling. This isn't Emily. This is something else. The creature stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. You're too late. You've always been too late. Lena's throat tightened as the air grew colder, the darkness around her closing in. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the mirror's power. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. I won't leave you here. The creature's smile faded, its expression shifting into something far more sinister. You don't have a choice. Lena's body trembled as the creature stepped closer, its dark, hollow eyes locking onto hers. The twisted version of Emily raised a hand, the cold air crackling with energy as she spoke. You didn't think it would be this easy, did you? The creature asked, its voice low and mocking. The mirror doesn't just show reflections, Lena. It shows what's hidden, what you refuse to see. Lena shook her head, backing away further, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't real. You're not Emily. You can't be." The creature tilted its head, the smile returning. "I've always been here, Lena. You've always known it. You just didn't want to believe." Tears blurred Lena's vision as the truth began to sink in. This wasn't Emily. Emily had been lost long ago, and what remained was nothing more than a shell, twisted and corrupted by the mirror's power. All this time, Lena had been chasing a ghost, clinging to a false hope. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. She had failed. Emily was gone, and now there was no way out. The creature that wore Emily's face loomed over her, its voice a soft, cruel whisper. "You've been feeding the mirror all along, Lena. With your grief. Your obsession. And now it's time for you to join me." The darkness surged around them, the void crackling with a malevolent energy that seeped into Lena's skin. She could feel the mirror's pull, dragging her deeper into the abyss, trapping her in the same twisted fate that had claimed Emily. "No," Lena choked out, her voice barely audible. I can't." But it was too late. The mirror had already claimed her. Lena gasped as her eyes flew open. She was back in her home, sprawled on the cold floor of the room where the mirror had stood. The candles had burned out, leaving the room in near darkness. For a moment, she thought she had escaped, thought she had broken free from the nightmare. But then she heard it, a soft, slow creaking behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light filtering through the window, was Emily. Lena's heart soared with hope. She did it. She saved her. "Emily," Lena whispered, her voice hoarse. You're back." Emily smiled, a soft, sweet smile that seemed almost too perfect. Lena's relief was short-lived. As Emily stepped closer, a strange coldness washed over the room. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and Lena's limbs grew numb as a chill settled deep in her bones. Emily's smile never wavered as she walked past Lena, heading toward the door. But as she left, Lena's breath hitched. She turned back to the shattered pieces of the mirror and saw her own reflection, staring back at her from inside the shards. Her reflection's wide, terrified eyes met her own, trapped behind the fractured glass, unable to escape. Lena's body trembled as the realization hit her with a crushing weight. She hadn't saved Emily. She had taken her place. Lena was trapped inside the mirror, doomed to the same twisted fate she had tried to save her sister from. And as Emily, now something far darker and more sinister, walked out the door, Lena's reflection watched, helpless and alone, as the pieces of the mirror slowly began to reform. The mirror had claimed its next victim. And now, it waited for another. The mirror, now whole again, stands untouched in the dimly lit room. Its ornate frame gleams faintly in the darkness, the intricate carvings twisting in ways that seem almost alive under the low light. Dust settles on the surface, but it never lingers for long, as if the mirror refuses to be forgotten. In the reflection, there is no Lena, no sign of her face. But if you look closely, if you watch the glass long enough, a flicker of movement can be seen. A shadow behind the surface, a silhouette pacing endlessly, trapped in a world of silent torment. Lena's eyes stare out, hollow and wide with terror, her hands pressed against the glass, helpless to escape. Her screams are silent, her reflection bound by the malevolent force that has claimed her soul. Outside, the house remains eerily quiet, abandoned by those who once lived there. Emily is gone, her figure last seen disappearing into the night, her eyes black voids of malice, her smile too wide, too calm. No one in the town notices her absence. No one questions the empty house or the lingering coldness that clings to the walls. Weeks pass, and the town moves on, oblivious to the curse that festers inside. One day, a real estate agent visits, preparing to sell the property. He stumbles upon the mirror, admiring its ancient beauty, unaware of the souls it holds captive. He runs his fingers over the smooth surface, enchanted by its dark allure. The faintest ripple disturbs the glass, but he doesn't notice. Later that day, the mirror is packed up and sent to an antique shop across town, ready to find a new home. In the final moment, the mirror sits in the corner of the shop, waiting. Its surface gleams, perfectly still, perfectly silent. But in the depth of its reflection, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the whisper. She's waiting. The cycle begins again.